Hello again, everyone. It is Gordon Majak here, back on a Sunday afternoon, back with another episode of Timeless Pop, Rock, and Soul. And today, I have to say, is a pretty big day here on the channel, and that is because we are going to do something of a birthday celebration a couple days out from the birthday of one of my all-time favorite artists, and that would be, aren't you dying to know, the late, great Terry Kath of Chicago. This photograph here taken in November of 1977 at the final concert for Terry in Chicago here in Seattle before his passing just a couple months later. So there is Terry Kath just a couple months before he passed. How about that? From Seattle Center Coliseum concert, November 77. Here's another one from that show. That's a pretty good shot, huh? My buddy Mike Sloat took some pretty great concert pictures back in the day. Terry Kath of Chicago, born January 31st, 1946, so his birthday coming up here in just a couple days. And as we said, tragically passed on January 23rd of 1978, just about a week shy of his 32nd birthday. The great Terry Kath leaving this earthly plane at the age of only 31. Just unbelievable. And I will speak at the end of the episode here, not this particular episode, but the final episode. What I'm going to do, I'm going to play you guys 3 songs. Now, I've told you before that Terry Kath era Chicago is my favorite, my single favorite musical catalog there. Those first 11 albums, the first 11 Chicago albums, the Terry Kath era, that is my favorite catalog of music in all of the pop, rock, and soul timeless music universe. So I'm going to play 3 songs today from Terry Kath in Chicago to show 3 different sides of Terry's amazing musical personality. In this video, we will start at the very beginning and sort of see where this whole Chicago Terry Kath thing started. In the second video, we will land somewhere in the middle of that great run that Terry and Chicago had in the 70s. And in the third and final video, we will sort of look at the final chapter there, the epilogue of the amazing career and the amazing run that Terry Kath in Chicago had back there in the late 60s and through most of the 70s before his tragic passing. Now, I want to say very clearly here, I am not going to talk about the Terry Kath's life history and tell his life story. I will talk about his death a little bit in that third and final episode, since we'll sort of be putting the final chapter on it then. So I will tell you a little bit about my memories of his death and his passing. But in the meantime, I really want the emphasis to be on the music. And I think I've picked some pretty good selections here to give you guys. And of course, all you longtime Chicago fans, you old school Chicago fans already know all this stuff. But I think I've picked a pretty good choice here. 3 songs to really give you guys a great idea of the genius of Terry Kath. How about that shot? Pretty good shot, huh? That's pretty amazing. 1977. We are going to start here in this first video at the very beginning. And that means, you know what? Boom. Chicago Transit, it's probably better if I do over here. Chicago Transit Authority, the first album. We are going to hear from the original master recording CD that was produced by Mobile Fidelity. That's one of my 2 favorite versions of this album. There was that cool album cover art. Always love that. And I think there's a good shot of Terry in here as well, right down there by my finger. There he is, Terry Kath, guitar and vocals. There's your whole Chicago lineup, of course. Robert Lamb, Peter Cetera, James Pankow, and Danny Serafine across the top, and Terry Kath, Lee Loughnane, and Walter Parazaider there across the bottom. So, Chicago Transit Authority, 1969. This album comes out in April of 69. Terry Kath, by my calculations, around 22, not quite 23 years old at the time that they're recording this album. And as we've heard, supposedly Terry Kath was a self-taught musician who couldn't read or write music other than the chord charts and rhythm charts that the Chicago composers Robert Lamb and James Pankow gave him and the other guys in the rhythm section to work off when they were recording. But he had such a phenomenal ear, of course, that he was able to still nonetheless show quite a tremendous mastery of music. And no better example of that than, well, you can't see, the print is so small, but the very first song from the very first side of the first album, we're going to hear a Terry Kath composition called Introduction. And the title is no misnomer, because by all intents and purposes, this is sort of Chicago's mission statement. I think that's what Robert Lamb called it once in an interview. Terry's song there to open the album and open that first side and open basically their recorded career together for Chicago really was the band's mission statement. And notwithstanding the fact that Terry allegedly couldn't read or write music, what we have here, as the story goes, is Terry had this entire song that you're going to hear here in a second, 6 minutes and 35 seconds. He had this entire song in his head. And when they went in to record the album, he took aside James Pankow, who, of course, already had great talent as an arranger, as a brass arranger, and as an arranger in general of the band, and a great trombonist, of course, James Pankow. And Terry Kath took him aside and communicated to him musically what he wanted for this song so that James Pankow could write out the chart for the horn players and the rest of the band. So here you have Terry Kath, self-taught, and here you have James Pankow, who was a college-educated music major, music theory major, right, who could write music, read music, and do the whole thing, arrange the whole thing for a whole band, or even a big band for that fact, because he had experience in his past arranging for big bands. James Pankow did. So Terry Kath takes James Pankow aside and communicates to him, sings the parts, plays the parts. And even James Pankow, the seasoned vet of arranging that he was, said later on in an interview there in that great Terry Kath documentary, said that his mind was just absolutely blown, that he could not believe the innate level of musical genius and musical understanding and musical wisdom that Terry Kath had as a self-taught player, that he could organize all of these musical parts of this song in his head and lay them out to James Pankow so clearly. And James Pankow said that when he wrote out the chart, he just looked at the sheet music in amazement because he couldn't believe that Terry Kath had that whole song mapped out in his head, despite not even being able to actually write those parts out, but they were all there in his head. And when you hear the result, you just won't believe it. Now, I talk about this song really showing sort of the innovative and progressive side of Terry Kath. And it's sort of impossible to even be objective about this now all these years later, because you just can't imagine that one day the band didn't exist, or they didn't have anything out, musically in the marketplace. And then one day this album just drops, right? Like a bomb on the music scene. And for people that bought this album, the first thing that they would have heard was this song. Terry Kath's opening salvo, as it were, the mission statement for the band, and he put the whole thing together in his head. It's really just unbelievable to think at 22 or 23, not only what an incredibly mature and gifted guitarist he already was at that age, as you'll hear in his ridiculous solo in the middle of this song. Not only such a gifted guitarist, he's in my top 3 all time after all, but such a great vocalist, such a soulful vocalist, immediately establishing that great soulful vocal sound that he was the signature of there in the very earliest days of Chicago, with Terry Kath was really almost the front man and the lead singer and the lead guitarist, right? Before it sort of bounced around the group and found its way to Peter Cetera. But there it was right out of the gate on the first album and the first song, a real identity and a real signature sound for Chicago, with Terry Kath laying it out. Here's who we are and here's what we're going to do. And just sit back and check this out. I'm not going to stop it during the song. I hate to stop it and break up the flow of the music. There's so many moments in this song that I want to draw your attention to. But I think the one that I will point to is just listen to that attitude on that guitar solo in the middle of the song as they come out of that slow horn break and they move into the guitar solo. And there's about three different guitar parts going on, but that main melodic line that is the solo right there in the center of the channel, just the edge and the attitude and the just the fire that Terry Kath brought to that part. The first musical statement that he and the band ever make at such a young age. And to me, that was sort of an indicator right there of what was ahead for these guys, right? From the Chicago Transit Authority album in 1969, it is the legendary Terry Kath birthday celebration here on Timeless Pop, Rock, and Soul. And this is where it all began. The song is called Introduction. attitude. Listen to the attitude in this solo. Not a bad way to start your career, huh? Man, the balls on those guys to come out of the gate on this first album, a double album, a 7-man band. Yeah, and you know, the jazz rock, quote unquote jazz rock, that's what they called it back in the day. The jazz rock thing may have been already happening. Of course, you know, Blood, Sweat, and Tears was already on their second album by the time Chicago got to their first one here. And in fact, that Blood, Sweat, and Tears album that was so famous, the second one that was produced by Chicago's producer, James William Guercio, that album was just about in early 1969 to win a Grammy, I think, for Album of the Year, right? So that's what a great job Blood, Sweat, and Tears did on that record. And yet I would argue that, and I love Blood, Sweat, and Tears, so don't get me wrong for 1 second. I would argue that this song, Introduction by Terry Kath, on this first side of the CTA album, I would argue that this was such a bold and outrageous musical statement that these guys basically ended the careers. I think Chicago ended the careers of anyone else who was ever going to attempt to do this sort of fusion of pop, rock, and soul, and they've got classical influences going in there, and the jazz thing obviously is happening in various influences within the band. Terry Kath himself, of course, famously influenced by any number of jazz guitarists, including Joe Pass and Barney Kessel and Howard Roberts. And so, along with, of course, his other influences of Jimi Hendrix, most notably, people always bring out the name of Jimi Hendrix when talking about Terry Kath. But Terry had a lot of other influences on the guitar as well, and even though he was self-taught and, as we said, couldn't read or write music, to communicate a song like this, so complex and so layered, with so many different parts going on and intertwining and overlapping, and the fact that Terry Kath had this whole arrangement in his head and could communicate it so clearly to James Pankow that James Pankow could write it out exactly the way Terry Kath heard it. It's really pretty incredible because there is so much going on in this song. This song is so complex, and that's why I say I always think of this song as really a great statement of that innovative and progressive side of Terry Kath. That he could not only create that sound of this rhythm section, which is basically just like a locomotive thundering down the tracks on this song. There's the lead vocal and that main melody line. There are verses in this song, but there don't appear to be choruses. So the very structure of the song is already out of the norm, way out of the norm from the very beginning. And then you slow it down there in the middle for the trombone solo and the trumpet solo before Terry comes blazing in with that incredible guitar solo. And then there's a drum breakdown, and then it comes back into the main section and main statement of the song before wrapping it up 6.5 minutes later. I just think that this is such a bold statement by Terry Kath in Chicago, and I think this was certainly not consciously perhaps on their part, but subconsciously, I just can't help but wonder if the guys in Chicago sort of knew something, if you know what I mean, that they kind of had a feeling of confidence of just where they stood in the musical scene. And I think maybe they kind of in their back of their minds knew exactly what they were doing when they laid down the law, not only on this song, but the rest of this whole album. I mean, this was a 2-record set, and you just think about everything that's on here. Does anybody really know what time it is? Beginnings, questions 67 and 68, poem 58, South California Purples, I Am a Man. I mean, just an incredible statement right out of the gate from Chicago. But the audacity on the first song that people would hear when they buy the album to put introduction, Terry Kath's mission statement, right up front there. Man, I think that ended some careers. I think that was basically Chicago's way of saying to Blood, Sweat, and Tears and any other aspiring horn bands or rock bands with horns, however you want to call it. I think that was Terry Kath in Chicago's way of saying, yeah, that jazz rock thing that you guys do is cool and everything, but can you do this? And the fact of the matter was that any band could have horns in it, but what was really unique about Chicago was not so much the horn section. It was the talents of not only the whole rhythm section, which is ridiculous in its own right, with Robert Lamb, Peter Cetera, and Danny Serafine on keyboards, bass, and drums, respectively. But the real secret weapon was, of course, Terry Kath. And that's something that no other, quote, horn band, whether it was Blood, Sweat, and Tears or any of the others that came after, that was the one thing that none of them could ever get. There was no other guitarist out there that was sounding like Terry Kath, that had that edge and that attitude and that maturity and just that depth of feeling in his playing. That was not a normal thing back then. And of course, the British guitarists and Jimi Hendrix, Jimmy Page, Jeff Beck, and Eric Clapton and Hendrix, those guys got all the publicity back there in the day. But for Terry Kath to come out and say, yeah, that's cool and everything, but check this out, I just think that is about the ballsiest thing I have ever seen an artist do on their very first record. And that just one of many reasons why Terry Kath, such a giant, man, that time with Chicago, that's like my number one all time. He's in my top 3 favorite guitarists all time, right there with the great George Benson and the great David Gilmour. Terry Kath right there at the top of the guitar mountain for me when it comes to my favorites. An incredible singer, an incredible songwriter and composer, as you just heard, and just a remarkable all-around talent. And I always say it, man, so many of my favorite musicians have come and gone and have passed away. I talk about it all the time. The 2 that just gutted me the most, that just to this day, the great Terry Kath and Amy Winehouse. And Terry Kath was where that first happened for me back there in 1978 when we lost Terry. That was sort of my introduction to what happens when one of your musical heroes dies way too early. But we will get to that in the third video. We wanted to start right here at the very beginning with Chicago Transit Authority. They're letting it all hang out, right? That's probably just about what it looked like back in the day. Terry Kath in Chicago. We will see you in the next one. We're going to jump ahead a few years and sort of land in the middle of that incredible run that Terry had with Chicago and sort of see what his perspective was like then, as opposed to what it was like here at the very beginning in 1969. The mission statement. Well, let's fast forward a little bit and see how it's going with the mission statement. That will be in the next one. See you then. Terry Kath. Ooh-wee, what a monster. Let's celebrate that, man. Godzilla on guitar. Incredible.